Hey guys, welcome back. We're less than a week away from the season opener here in Michigan. So in today's video, I want to talk to you guys about our approach to hunting those first few weeks of October. So some early season hunting strategies. But before we dive into today's video, I want to let you guys know that we are producing additional whitetail content on the Whitetail Partners YouTube channel. Along with myself, there will also be several other guys putting together content for this channel. We've got Sam over in Wisconsin, Lee down in Tennessee, Josh down in Georgia, and Greg down in Ohio. These guys put down some really nice deer, so I would recommend listening to what they have to say. Get that alternative or additional perspective on hunting strategy and land management. Again, the YouTube channel was Whitetail Partners. Head over there, subscribe to make sure that you don't miss any of the additional content that's coming out. But now let's talk about some early season hunting strategies. Our take on hunting those first few weeks of October. And one of the first things I do want to say is that everyone has a different approach to hunting. Our way of hunting the early season might be different than someone else's, and that's okay. What works for us might not work for somebody else. There are a lot of different ways to get the job done. This is a little random, but my son, he's starting to get interested in Star Wars, so he asked me to watch a few of the movies with him. And one of the reoccurring pieces of advice that the Jedi are always giving, to the Padawan learners is to always stay patient. And for those of you guys who have been following this channel for a while know that our approach to hunting the early season tends to be a little bit more conservative. Now, that doesn't mean that there's never a reason to go full Anakin and be aggressive in the early season, but we'll touch on that later on in the video. But that's the first tip that I have for you guys when hunting during the early season, and that's try your best to stay patient. And I know that it can be hard. We just spent the last 10 months working on our property, working on the habitat improvements, planting food plots. Your trail cameras have been out, you have pictures of nice deer. It's very tempting to want to hunt aggressive in the early part of the season. But just try your best to stay patient and try to avoid pushing too far into your property early on in the season. One of the last things that we want to do after putting in all of this work on our property is to educate the deer early on in the season, reducing the chances that we're going to have success later on. Circling back to the Whitetail Partners YouTube channel, we actually just posted a video on saving your better stand locations or trying to avoid hunting those better stand locations early on in the season. So if you want to hear more on that, on this first point, definitely go check out that video. The second tip that I have for you guys for hunting during the early part of the season is another thing that we should try to avoid. So along with trying to avoid pushing too far into our property early on, we should also try to avoid or limit our morning hunts. Typically for a morning sit, we're focusing on hunting near those bedding areas, that thick, secure, high stem count cover. And the reason that we like to focus on bedding areas in the morning is because in the morning, a lot of times these deer are off in those destination food sources. So as the deer are off in the destination food source, we can slip into those bedding areas or near those bedding areas and catch the deer as they move back to them. However, during the early part of the hunting season, early October, a lot of the bucks that we're targeting are actually getting back to these bedding areas well before daylight. There have been a lot of studies monitoring the movement of collared bucks. And one thing that they see in these studies is that these older deer, they're leaving those destination food sources and heading back to those bedding areas well before daylight. So if you're walking to your stand in the morning to hunt in and around a bedding area, there's a good chance that you might bump that buck as he's also moving back to that area before daylight. Or another scenario would be that he's already made it back to that bedding area, and then as you're trying to sneak into it, you might kick him out then as well. Just like we said earlier on, the last thing that we want to do early on in the season is educate these deer that they're being hunted. And by pushing into those morning stand locations in early October, a lot of times you have a higher probability of bumping or spooking those bucks as opposed to getting a shot opportunity. So those first two tips that we talked about were more things that you should try to avoid or limit early on in the hunting season. But for the remainder of the video, I want to talk about things that we're focusing on early on in the hunting season. And the first thing that I want to talk about is when should we be hunting? And if we're trying to avoid or limit our morning hunts early on in the season, then by process of elimination, that leaves our afternoon or evening sits. One of the most predictable patterns early on in the hunting season is a deer's bedding to feeding movement. Throughout the day, the deer are going to spend a majority of their time in those thick, high stem count bedding areas. But as we push into later in the afternoon, early evening, they start to leave the security of those bedding areas and move towards their destination food source. That bedding to feeding movement is what we're trying to capitalize on early on in the hunting season when trying to get an opportunity at one of the local bucks. When hunting that bed to feed movement, there are still a couple things that you want to make sure that you're taking into consideration. And the first is that you're not pushing too close into those bedding areas for a very similar reason as to why we don't recommend hunting a lot in the morning during the early part of the season. And that's because we don't want to get too close and risk bumping or educating those deer that they're being hunted. Instead, we prefer to place our stands closer to that destination food source, and if possible, on a transitional food source, before that destination. So a pass-through or micro or kill plot, or maybe soft mass trees, a food source that those deer are going to hit within cover before they make it to that destination. Hunting these transitional or pass-through food sources have a few advantages. And the first is that a lot of times, because these food sources are within cover, these deer are comfortable moving to them within daylight. So this gives you more shot opportunities. The second is, this is not the destination. Now, that apple tree within cover, that's not where these deer are going to hang out all night. They still want to get out to that soybean field or that hay field. So as these deer leave that pass-through food plot or that transitional food source and move to that destination, this gives you an opportunity to slip out of your stand undetected. Another thing to try to avoid when hunting this bed to feed pattern is a lot of times it's not the best idea to hunt the destination. And that's because this is where a lot of the deer are going to be hanging out for a majority of the night, making it a lot more difficult for you to get out of your stand undetected. So again, instead of hunting the destination, try to find a transitional or a pass-through food source that's along the way. Another plug for the Whitetail Partners YouTube channel, we also put a video out on several early season food sources that we like to focus on. So if you're having trouble finding early season food sources on your property, definitely give that video a watch. The next tip that I want to talk about for hunting during the early season also relates to when you should be hunting. And this is a strategy that we actually carry on throughout the rest of the season as well. And that's when possible, you should be trying to time your hunts to cold fronts. Whitetails, and this includes older bucks, they move more post cold front, and the collared buck studies support this as well. So if you're trying to increase your chances of having an opportunity at one of your target bucks, then you need to try your best to time your hunts with those cold fronts. When you see that temperature drop and that barometric pressure start to rise, this is a great time to head out to your stand. Now, I know that's not always possible, especially for those of us that work. It doesn't always happen to be where the cold front moves through on the weekend. Sometimes that happens on a Wednesday. And although we'd like to, we can't just, skip work to go hunting. So what do we do if we have time to go hunting, but the weather isn't ideal? In these scenarios, we really like to do what are called observational sits. An observational sit is exactly what it sounds like. For the most part, you are going to be observing deer movement. You're choosing a stand location a lot of times closer to your property border, closer to your cabin or where you park. You have a relatively easy way in and out of that stand, low probability of spooking deer, and you're trying to observe deer movement or hopefully try to pattern deer for future hunts. Now, these observational stands, they're not throwaway spots by any means. There's always going to be a few trails that are coming off of your neighbor's property and heading into yours, and if you can combine this with some sort of a pinch point, whether that's natural or man-made, you can have a pretty good observational low impact spot really close to your property border. So guys, that's pretty much our approach to hunting during the early part of the season. Like I said earlier, it's fairly conservative. We really like to stay patient early on. We like to wait for better weather, wait for seasonal timing before we start to push into those better stand locations. But also, like I said earlier, that doesn't mean that there's never a time to go full Chosen One, go full Anakin Skywalker and be aggressive. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about now. While this doesn't happen every season, there are going to be years where you should be pushing in a little bit further early on in the season to hunt your target buck. And it really comes down to whether or not you have that deer patterned. And we have a few different ways that we like to pattern bucks early on in the hunting season. The first is with these observational sits. A lot of times with these, you have a window into the deer movement on your property. And if you're sitting back and you start to notice that a buck is coming into a field or a food plot from a certain area with a particular wind, and he's doing this consistently, that pattern is not random. This is a scenario that I would go in and hunt that buck early in the season. The next way you could potentially pattern a buck in the early season would be by using your historical trail camera data. If you have history with an individual buck and based on your historical trail camera photos, you know that he hangs out in a certain area of your property early on in the season. Maybe it's an early season apple tree that's always dropping and he likes to hit those apples before heading out to the destination food source. This is another scenario where if I have a pretty good idea as to what that buck's pattern is early on in the season, and I know that deer's alive, then I'm gonna take the chance to push in a little farther to hunt that deer in the early season. The last way that we like to pattern bucks in the early season, and this is kind of similar to our observational sits except we don't have to be out there, is with our cell cameras. If you start to notice that a buck is using a huntable area of your property during daylight and is doing it with regularity, you're gonna wanna go in and hunt that deer before his patterns change. Now, like I said earlier, these scenarios don't play out every single year, but there's always a chance. 2 years ago, we were able to pattern a buck early on using our cell cameras and actually go in and kill that deer on October 1st. So while for the most part our hunting strategy during the early part of the season is more conservative, that does not mean that we're never going to be aggressive if the opportunity presents itself. So guys, that's going to wrap it up for today's video on a few strategies for hunting during the early part of the season. If you guys have any additional strategies or any questions, please drop those in the comment section below. I'll get back to those as soon as I can, and we will see you guys in the next video.